Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. It was late at night when Thomas heard it. The wind was howling outside and rain was slamming against the window panes. A huge clap of thunder shook the apartment building and suddenly he heard voices. They were whispering right from inside the walls of his apartment. At first he thought it was just the wind. Surely it had to be. There was no way anyone could be out in this weather, let alone standing right outside his front door. He was just about to go back to sleep when he heard one of the voices say his name. He sat straight up in bed. Had he imagined that? No. There they were again, whispering his name over and over. Join us, Thomas. Join us, Thomas. Join us, Thomas. Before he knew it, the whispers had escalated into dozens of voices all talking at once. And they weren't just saying his name anymore. They were inviting him to join them. Join us. Join us. Join us. It was then that Thomas noticed the gaps in the wall behind his bed. They were small spaces between the plaster and the wallpaper that had always been there. He just never noticed them before because they were covered by his dresser. But now he could see the dark openings as clearly as if someone had drawn them with a marker. His mind was racing. Was this some kind of gas leak? Had the pipes in the wall been compromised by the water and the storm? Or was it something more sinister? Maybe an animal of some kind had gotten trapped in the wall and was now clawing its way toward him, trying to get inside the apartment. He started to panic and got out of bed. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit there and listen to those whispers any longer. That's when he noticed the one thing that made the most sense, the storm. It had to be the storm. All this time he'd been focused on the voices and he'd completely forgotten about the raging thunderstorm outside. He went to the window and looked out at the darkness. The wind was really picking up now. Big branches were swaying in the darkness and the thunder rumbled like a giant's stomach. And then he heard it again, right behind the window. The voices. He turned off the light in the room and put his ear against the window pane. At first, he could only hear the wind and the rain. Then he started to hear the voices. They sounded close, like they were right behind the glass with him. He could make out a few of the words they were saying. Join us, Thomas. Join us, Thomas. Join us, Thomas. He pulled away from the window, his heart pounding. Was he losing his mind? What was happening? He needed to get out of there. He grabbed his keys and ran for the door. As he fumbled with his keys, he could still hear the voices, closer now, louder. Join us, Thomas! Join us, Thomas! Finally, the door opened and he stumbled out into the hallway. He didn't stop to think about where he was going. He just kept moving, stumbling down the hallway, the voices following him all the way. He finally stopped in front of his neighbor's door. He could hear the voices now, right behind his neighbor's door. He could even hear what sounded like footsteps. Was whatever was out there actually trying to get into his apartment? He knocked on his neighbor's door, but there was no answer. Of course, there wasn't going to be an answer. It was the middle of the night. And besides, his neighbor was on vacation. Thomas hesitated, then reached out and knocked again. This time he knocked louder, but there was still no answer. He could hear the voices behind the closed door. Join us, Thomas! Join us, Thomas! And then he started to hear scratching sounds. Whatever was out there was trying to get in. But what was out there? If it was an animal, he needed to find a way to stop it before it got through the wall and into his apartment. That's when he remembered the maintenance closet. There had to be a way to get into the wall from there. He just hoped it wasn't too late. He raced down the hall to the maintenance closet and fumbled with the lock. Finally, the door creaked open and he slipped inside. It was dark and the air was stale, but at least he was out of earshot of the whispers. He leaned against the cool metal door, trying to catch his breath. What had he been thinking? Why had he come out here in the first place? Then he heard it. A small scratching sound from behind the wall. It was coming from the other side of the wall, from his apartment. Whatever was out there had gotten into the wall and was now on the other side. He could hear the scratching getting louder, and then the whispers started up again. This time they were right behind him. Join us, Thomas. Join us, Thomas. Join us, Thomas. The door to the maintenance closet flew open and a pair of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness. Hello, friends. It was a dreary November day, the kind of day when clouds seem to weep with the ceaseless patter of rain. Inside a cozy home, a woman named Elsie sat by the window, sipping her tea. She was alone. Her husband had passed away a year ago, and her children had flown the nest long before that. The house was big, the rooms were cavernous, and the silence was deafening. That's why Elsie was always happy to have company, even if it was just the postman or the grocery delivery guy. Anyone who came to the door was welcome to stay as long as they liked and chat about anything they wanted. It was better than the suffocating quiet. One evening, as the rain poured outside, Elsie was startled by a sudden draft. She turned toward the window and gasped. There, in the dim light, she saw the shadow of a man standing in front of it. He was tall and thin, and his face seemed to be hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. But then, just as quickly, he was gone. Elsie shook her head, wondering if she'd imagined the whole thing. But the next time the rain poured, there he was again. She watched, mesmerized, as he walked up to the window and gazed out at the garden. This time she wasn't afraid. She was just curious. Who was this mysterious visitor? Why did he come every time it rained? And why did he hide his face? She got up from her chair and went over to the window. As she got closer, she could see that the man's shadow wasn't moving. He wasn't looking out into the garden at all. He was staring straight ahead, but his eyes seemed to be fixed on something behind her. Suddenly, an idea struck her. She grabbed a flashlight from the hall and hurried back to the window. She shone the beam right at the man, and he vanished. Startled, Elsie switched the light off and on again, but he didn't reappear. Had she imagined the whole thing? Was it a trick of the light? Or was there a perfectly rational explanation? Over the next few days, Elsie hardly slept. Every time the rain poured, she would lie awake listening for the telltale draft. Then she would get up and creep to the window, but the man was never there, so she began to think that she'd really just imagined the whole thing. Then one night, as lightning flashed, she saw him again. He was standing by the window, and for a moment she could see his face. It was pale and drawn, and his eyes were wide with fear. Then, just as suddenly, he was gone. When the lightning flashed again, Elsie saw that the window was open. She hurried over and closed it, then ran back to the window. There in the corner of the room, she saw a dark shape huddled on the floor. As she shone the flashlight on it, it stirred and looked up at her with the same wild eyes she'd seen in the shadow. Then, to her horror, it began to rise. It was a skeleton, and it was reaching out a hand to her. Elsie screamed and stumbled back, knocking the flashlight out of her hand. In the sudden darkness, the skeleton seemed to grow larger, its bones scraping together like castanets as it moved. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Elsie stood frozen, not daring to move. She could hear the wind and the rain, but there was no sound from the skeleton. Then slowly, ever so slowly, she reached down and picked up the flashlight. As the beam hit the skeleton, it vanished. Elsie stared at the spot where it had been standing. How could this be happening? What was this place turning into? She had a sudden urge to get out of the house, to escape and never look back. But as she turned to go, she noticed something strange. On the floor where the skeleton had been standing, there was a small pile of pebbles. And as she bent down to pick them up, she saw that they were arranged in a circle. Then it hit her. The pebbles were arranged in the shape of a footprint. And at that moment, she knew that she wasn't alone in the house. There was someone else there with her, or something, and it had been trying to warn her. But what had it been trying to warn her about? And why? Those questions echoed in her mind long after the skeleton had vanished. She looked out at the storm-tossed sea and wondered if she would ever find the answers. The Forgotten Room. A weary traveler, drenched to the bone by a sudden summer storm, stumbled into a small inn, desperate for shelter. The old building smelled of mildew and stale waste, but it was the only option. He pulled off his dripping cloak, revealing a handsome young man in his early 20s. "You look like you just walked out of a river," said the innkeeper, eyeing the dripping cloth. "Be sure to wring out your cloak before you bring it inside, son, or we'll have to charge you for the extra laundering." The young man forced a smile. "Wouldn't miss it for the world. Say, do you have any private rooms available?" "Only room 6, the innkeeper replied, shaking his head. "But I wouldn't recommend it if I were you. It's an old room. You'd probably be better off just sleeping in the common area by the fire." "Thanks, but I'd prefer a room, especially one with a lock on the door." The young man was clearly hiding something. The innkeeper shrugged and grabbed a key from behind the counter. "Suit yourself. It's at the end of the hall on the right. Just try not to make too much noise. Some of the other patrons are light sleepers." Room 6 was at the very end of the dark, narrow hall. As the traveler closed the door behind him, he heard a loud crash, followed by what sounded like screams. He shuddered. Perhaps the innkeeper had been right. Maybe he would have been better off by the fire. He set his bag down on the dusty floor and pulled back the heavy curtains. To his surprise, the room wasn't nearly as bad as he'd expected. There was a large 4-poster bed in the corner and a single window overlooking the courtyard. In the center of the room was a table with 2 chairs, one of which was overturned, and in the corner was a full-length mirror. As he began unpacking, he heard a noise that made him freeze. Someone or something was definitely walking around in the room next door. Footsteps. He strained to listen. The footsteps stopped. Then he heard a loud bang, followed by what sounded like a scream. He tried to convince himself that it was just an animal, but the rational part of his brain told him there was no way an animal could cause that much noise. And what kind of animal howled at night? He pulled his chair over to the door and peered through the keyhole. Whatever was on the other side of the door didn't look like any animal he'd ever seen. He turned away, suddenly feeling very claustrophobic. The room was starting to feel very cold. He pulled his cloak tighter around him and tried to convince himself that he was being ridiculous. It was just an inn. What was he? Some kind of scared little girl? He pulled out his bedroll and laid down, but sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined the creature from the other room crawling over him. Finally, exhaustion overwhelmed his fear, and he drifted off to sleep. In the morning, he awoke to the sound of the inn coming to life. People were talking, doors were opening and closing. He got up, threw on his clothes, and went out into the hall. He found the innkeeper polishing glasses behind the counter. "Say, how long has this place been here?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The innkeeper looked up. "This place? Oh, about 100 years, he replied. "What brings up the rear?" "Just curious. Is room 6 still off limits?" he asked. "Ah, room 6, the innkeeper sighed. "No, it's not off limits. Anyone can rent it. Matter of fact, it's the best room in the inn." "Really? Why?" The innkeeper's eyes suddenly turned very cold. "Because it's the best bloody room in the inn," he said loudly. Then, as if ashamed of his outburst, he lowered his voice. "I'm sorry. I don't know what's gotten into me. Here, let me show you something." He led the traveler into the hall and pointed to the doors at the end. "Behind that door is room 6, he said, "and behind that door is room 7. Now those are 2 of our best rooms, but there's a catch." The traveler frowned. "What?" The innkeeper leaned closer. "Neither of those rooms have ever been opened. They've been sealed for 50 years. No one's been in or out since 1873. The traveler's jaw dropped. He stared at the doors as if he could see through them. He thought about the noise he'd heard the previous night, the heavy footsteps, the screams. What in the world could be going on behind that door? He thanked the innkeeper and hurried out into the bright sunshine. As he walked away, he could have sworn he heard a voice calling out to him from behind the door, but when he turned around, there was no one there. All his life, he'd been told that the world was full of wonders, places beyond our understanding. But until now, he'd never believed it. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that he was not crazy, because what he'd heard that night in room 6 was no figment of his imagination. The floor was wet. The man's eyes widened in confusion. He took a step closer and then another. The wet footprints led from his front door all the way to his bedroom. His wife must have gotten home early, he thought, smiling. He quickened his pace, eager to surprise her. Maybe he could even get her favorite chocolates from the kitchen. He pushed open the door to the bedroom and stopped. The bed was neatly made. His wife wasn't there. And then he noticed something else. The footprints stopped at the bed. They didn't go around it or over it. They just stopped abruptly, as if whoever had made them had climbed into bed and then evaporated. He frowned, confused. Was she playing some sort of weird game? Had she seen a ghost? He shook his head, chuckling at the thought. She was definitely up to some spooky stuff again, he thought, and decided to get to the bottom of this. He carefully peeled back the covers, expecting to find his wife underneath. Instead, he found only an empty sheet. On top of it was a small, intricately carved wooden box. There was no mistaking the craftsmanship for anything other than what it was: a coffin. A chill ran down his spine. What the hell? He had to be dreaming. He pinched himself hard, but the pain was very real. He opened the box, revealing an even smaller one inside. This one was made of a dark metal that glinted ominously in the candlelight. He hesitated for only a moment before opening it. There was a single eye staring back at him. It was a lifelike glass eye, complete with a realistic bloodshot and cloudy cornea. The sight of it sent a jolt of fear through him. Who would do such a thing? Why? He threw the box shut, not bothering to hide it. He was too busy scanning the room for his wife. Where was she? Was she behind one of the curtains? Under the bed, perhaps? But those were just silly thoughts. He knew she wasn't there. He rushed to the window and tore aside the curtains. The storm had reached a crescendo, wind and rain battering against the glass. Lightning flashed, momentarily turning the world outside into broad daylight. That's when he saw them. In the muddy ground beneath the window, he saw a pair of footprints. They were identical to the ones in his bedroom, leading away from the house and disappearing into the mud. He felt a sudden rush of terror. It wasn't just his wife who had left footprints in the mud. Someone or something else had been here. Something that had entered his house, climbed into his bed and stared at him with a glass eye while he slept. He slammed the window shut and stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. What was he supposed to do now? He couldn't stay in that house, not after what had happened. He grabbed his coat and ran for the door, desperate to escape the suffocating feeling of dread that seemed to be seeping into his bones. As he fumbled with the locks, he heard a noise behind him. He whipped around to see the curtains moving slightly in the draft. But that wasn't what made him freeze in his tracks. It was the footprints. They were moving, the ones on the bed. They were inching closer to the edge, as if something were dragging itself towards the floor. He screamed and threw himself at the door, desperate to get away. He could hear the wind howling outside, but it was drowned out by the sound of his own pounding heart. He could feel the vibrations of the footprints on the bed, the slow, deliberate steps that seemed to mock his terror. He dared not look back. He just kept running, stumbling blindly into the darkness. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to get away from that house, from the footprints, from the eye. Finally, he burst out of the door and into the rain. He didn't stop running until he reached his car, collapsing inside, shivering, not from the cold, but from fear. As the rain washed over him, he looked back at the house, his home, his sanctuary, now nothing more than a dark, foreboding silhouette against the stormy sky. The footprints were still there, he realized, still moving closer to the edge of the bed. And the eye. He shuddered, remembering the eye was still watching. Walking home alone in the pouring rain, I didn't expect anything to happen. It was just one of those days where everything seemed to be going wrong. And then I heard it. It was like the sound of a small child singing a lullaby softly behind me. I stopped and turned around, but there was no one there. The voice was coming from behind me, but there was no one behind me. Still, I could hear the singing clearly, even through the rain. I started to walk again, and this time the voice started following me. I walked faster, and the singing followed. I quickened my pace and broke into a run, but then I heard the voice right beside me. I stopped running and turned around to see a little girl standing there with an umbrella over her head. Water was dripping down her nose and chin, and her cheeks were wet and shiny. "Can I help you?" I asked, surprised to see a child outside in such bad weather. "Are you lost?" The little girl shook her head and smiled at me. "No, I'm not lost. I live here." She pointed her chin toward a house at the end of the street. Then she turned back to the sidewalk and continued walking. "Well, that's good," I said, relieved. "But you shouldn't be out in this weather. Why don't you stay inside?" The girl stopped walking and turned back to face me. Her smile had disappeared, and her eyes were downcast. "I have to go home," she whispered. Her response confused me, but before I could ask her anything, she turned and ran off down the street. As I stood there watching her go, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The little girl had seemed so sad, and I couldn't understand why she would want to be out in the rain. I decided to follow her and see if she really did live on this street. Maybe her parents were worried sick about her, and I could tell them she was safe. As I walked, I kept hearing the sound of the little girl singing. At first, it had been a distant sound, but now it was right there beside me. I turned to look for her and saw that she had stopped in front of a house with its porch light turned on. I could hear her voice now, clear as day, as she sang the same lullaby over and over again. "Why do you come to me?" I called out. "You don't know me. You shouldn't be following me." The little girl stopped singing and looked up at me. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to follow you. I just wanted to sing for you." "Sing for me," I echoed, confused by her words. Then the little girl took a step forward and reached out her hand to me. "Come inside," she said. "I'll sing for you." For a moment I hesitated. Something about the little girl and her invitation made me uneasy. But then I thought, how could following a lost child make me uneasy? I knew she lived here, and surely her parents would be happy to see her. So I took a deep breath and nodded. As I stepped onto the porch and reached for the doorknob, the little girl sang, "Beware, the night is dark and full of fears." I froze. Why did she sound like a character from a horror movie? I slowly turned my head to look at her, but she was gone. The front door opened, and a woman stood there looking at me. "Can I help you?" she asked. Suddenly, I was filled with a sense of dread. I realized that the little girl had never actually spoken to me. She had only ever sung. And the song she had sung outside, the one about the dark and full of fears, was the same one she had sung on the porch. With a growing sense of unease, I answered, No, I'm sorry. I think I'm lost." In a village nestled amidst rolling hills and whispering trees lived a peculiar old man. The villagers called him the Storm Caller. They claimed he possessed a unique ability, the power to summon storms at will. But was it a gift or a curse? As a child, I remember hearing these tales from my grandmother. We'd sit on the porch of our home, sipping sweet tea as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. She would point to the old man's house on the hill and say, "That's where he lives, the one they call the Storm Caller." But why did they call him that? What had he done to earn, or perhaps be cursed with this ominous moniker? The stories changed with each retelling, but one detail remained constant. They all agreed that the old man could control the weather, specifically thunderstorms. My grandmother would always stop at this point, her eyes twinkling in the firelight, leaving me hanging, desperate for more. But Mama always said it was getting late and that I had to go inside, now. Many years have passed since those lazy summer evenings on the porch. And tonight, a fierce thunderstorm is raging outside, mirroring the turmoil in my heart. I'm back in the village, and tonight I seek out the truth behind the legend of the storm caller. I found the old man's house easily enough. It sits at the top of Weather Hill, just as the villagers had described. But the house is dark and silent. Not a single light breaks the gloom, not a sound disturbs the stillness. I hesitate, fear gnawing at me, wondering if the stories are true, if the old man is really here. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning splits the sky, followed by a deafening roar of thunder. The old man is home. I jump, startled by the sudden illumination. For a moment, I see everything in vivid detail. A rocking chair on the porch moves slightly. A curtain stirs in the living room, and in the bedroom, an old man coughs weakly. Then everything is plunged back into darkness. Cautiously, I move closer to the house, my heart pounding in my chest. More lightning flashes illuminate the old man's face. He sits in his rocking chair, eyes closed, seemingly oblivious to the storm's fury. I want to call out to him, to ask him about his gift, but my voice fails me. Then another bolt of lightning strikes, closer this time, so close that I can feel the heat on my skin. The old man's eyes snap open, filled with a wild, otherworldly light. He looks up at the sky and raises his arms as if embracing the storm. Night after night, the thunderstorms return, each one more violent than the last. But the old man seems unaffected. Each strike of lightning illuminates his face, revealing the peace that has settled on his features. Then, one morning, just as the first rays of sunlight peek through the clouds, chasing away the darkness, I return to the house. I find the front door ajar, so I push it open and step inside. The house is empty. There is no sign of the old man anywhere. The only evidence of his presence is a faint smell of pipe tobacco and a rocking chair that gently sways in the now calm breeze. Outside, the sky is clear, the clouds dispersed by the morning sun. A lone bird sings atop the weathered roof, its song echoing the tranquility that has descended upon the land. Where has he gone? Is he truly the storm caller, a master of the elements, or was he merely a man who loved the rain? I don't have the answers. All I know is that when the skies are dark and the winds grow cold, a part of me still seeks solace in the rhythm of the falling rain, hoping to hear the old man's laughter carried on the breeze. The incessant rain had been drumming against the old house for days. The gutters were overflowing, and there was a damp smell everywhere. One day, the mother went to check on her prize-winning African violets, only to find that their water had all leaked out, and they were wilting. She sighed. This was not good. It looked like she'd have to move them into the spare bedroom. As she stood up, her husband came in, his face grave. "I think we should check on the kids," he said. "They've got an early day at school tomorrow, but with this storm, the roof might collapse before then." "It's just an old roof," the wife replied dismissively. "Don't be silly. Nothing's going to happen." But even as she said it, she knew that wasn't true. For years, they had put off fixing the roof because it was just too expensive. Now, it was probably too late for that. She watched anxiously as her husband went up into the attic, followed by their 2 children. Moments later, he called out, "Come see this." The wife joined them, her heart sinking. Sure enough, one of the ceiling beams had come loose and was letting in a steady stream of water. It was making a small but rapidly growing stain on the ceiling. "We're going to have to board up the roof," her husband said. "I'll get the boards and you 2 get the tarps." Their son and daughter nodded, but the wife stayed rooted to the spot. She didn't want to do this. She could feel it in her bones that something bad was going to happen. "Come on, honey," her husband said, taking her hand. "It's just an old roof. What's the worst that could happen?" He gave her a reassuring kiss and led her to the attic door. They went up into the stifling hot attic and shut the door behind them. Then they got to work, securing the tarps over the hole in the roof. It was hard work, but they finished just as the storm outside reached its crescendo. The rain was pounding against the boards now, but it was still just water. The wife breathed a sigh of relief. Maybe her husband was right. Maybe nothing bad would happen. But then she heard it. From somewhere inside the attic, she heard a soft thud, followed by the distinct sound of footsteps. She froze. Was she imagining things? She couldn't possibly be, could she? She turned to her husband, whose face had gone pale. He was listening intently, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Her husband shook his head, his face a mask of concern. "What did you hear?" "Footsteps," she replied, her voice trembling. "I thought you heard it too. Didn't you?" He took her hand. "It's just the wind, honey. There's nothing up here but old junk. Come on, let's go downstairs." But as they made their way to the attic door, she heard it again, the sound of footsteps. And this time her husband heard it too. He put a hand on her shoulder. "Stay right here," he said, his voice tight. Then he went out into the hall and closed the door behind him. She heard him calling out to their children, his voice sharp with authority. "Get up here right now!" Moments later, all three of them were standing in the attic doorway, their faces pale in the flickering lamplight. They could hear the footsteps now, definitely coming from inside the attic. Slowly, very slowly, they began to make their way into the room, keeping close to each other for comfort. But whatever was up here was fast approaching, and they could hear it moving quickly toward them. Then suddenly, it stopped. They all froze, listening intently. Then, just as suddenly, the footsteps started up again, this time closer than before. They could hear the footsteps moving closer and closer until they were right outside the door. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence was broken only by the sound of the rain and the pounding of their hearts. Then the door creaked open. With trembling hands, the mother reached out and flicked on the light switch. The room was empty except for a single porcelain doll sitting on a shelf. She was perfectly dry, as though she'd never been touched by the rain. And as the family stared at her in horrified fascination, they could have sworn they saw her lips move. The first time it happened, I didn't think much of it. It was just a bit of condensation forming on the glass, nothing out of the ordinary. But as the days went on, it became more and more frequent, and I started to notice patterns in it. It all started on a Tuesday, or at least that's what I assumed it was. It was one of those days where the sky was a bruised purple, and the air was thick with humidity. The rain fell in sheets, drumming a steady beat against the window pane. I was in my room doing homework when I heard a knock on the bathroom door. "Knock, knock," it went, followed by my sister's voice. "You in there, Elle? You mind turning the light off? You're not gonna believe this, but we've got lightning in the house." "Yeah, sure," I said, not bothering to look up from my desk. My sister had a thing for dramatic flair. I rolled my eyes and turned off the overhead light, plunging the bathroom into darkness. I continued working until I heard the toilet flush and the door open. Then my sister's silhouette appeared in the doorway, framed by the light from the hallway. "See anything weird?" she asked, leaning in close to me. "Weird how?" I asked without looking up. "In the mirror," she whispered. I knew exactly what she was talking about. Every morning after she took a shower, my sister would come running into my room, all excited, saying she'd found something really cool. In the steamy mirror, the water vapor would form strange shapes that looked like cryptic messages written in hieroglyphics. At first, they were just random patterns. We'd stare at them for a while, trying to find meaning in the swirling shapes. But then the shapes sharpened, becoming recognizable letters. One day, she'd found the word run scrunched up in the corner. Another day, it was help. Once it spelled out danger. And now tonight, my sister was standing in front of it reading, "You are next." My sister screamed and stumbled back, knocking over my lamp. I stared at the mirror, confused. Whoever or whatever was doing this was getting bolder. It was no longer satisfied with leaving cryptic messages. It was issuing threats. But who would be behind this? Our house wasn't haunted, or at least I didn't think so. Sure, there were the usual drafts that rattled the windows and made the floorboards groan, but that was to be expected in an old house. Besides, I'd never seen a ghost, not one time. And if our house was haunted, why would a ghost wait until now to make its presence known? Every time I tried to dismiss it, something new would happen. Like last week when I came home from school early, I found a trail of wet footprints leading from the front door through the living room and into the kitchen. I followed the trail and traced the shape of the prints with my finger. They were definitely human. Whoever had come inside had slipped off their shoes at the door, which was weird because I lived alone. My parents were overseas and my sister was at college. That same day, I came home from the grocery store to find a chair overturned and a picture frame on the floor. My parents' wedding photo was missing. The one that hung above the fireplace had been replaced with a blank frame. Then there was the incident with the radio. I do not know if you've ever woken up in the middle of the night to static on the radio, followed by a voice that isn't there. That happened to me almost every night. When it did, I'd always wake up with a start, convinced someone had climbed into my bed and was whispering in my ear. But when I turned on the bedroom light, there was nothing there. Of course, people at school didn't help matters. Some of them thought it was hilarious to play spooky music whenever I walked past them in the hallway. Others openly wondered if I was going crazy. My best friend, Mark, told me I should take a break from watching horror movies. He thought that maybe I'd gotten a little too into it and was imagining things. All of this speculation only made me more determined to get to the bottom of what was happening in our house. And that's when I started keeping a journal, writing down every strange occurrence, every eerie sound, and every message that appeared in the mirror. Maybe if I could just document everything, I could find some kind of pattern, some kind of answer. But the thing with patterns is you need a lot of data to find them. And I ran out of nights before I got enough data. Because now, just when I thought things couldn't get any weirder, they did. The night before my 18th birthday, I woke up in the middle of the night and had to go to the bathroom. When I turned on the light, I saw it. Standing directly behind me was a woman. She was tall and thin like a piece of driftwood, her hair long and stringy, her face pale and gaunt. She had no eyes. Where her eyes should have been, there were only empty sockets. And then she smiled, and it was the most beautiful smile I'd ever seen. The old radio was crackling with static. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder roared like a hungry beast. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It wasn't the storm that bothered him. He was used to those. Living out in the middle of nowhere had its drawbacks. The nearest town was a good 20 minutes away, and the nearest hospital even further. So when the weather took a turn, Thomas always made sure he was prepared. What bothered him was the voice. Ever since he moved into this old farmhouse, he kept hearing strange things on his radio. Whispers, voices, music. None of it made any sense. Most of the time, it was just static. But whenever he thought he heard something, whenever he thought it was finally clear enough for him to make out what was being said, the power would go out, and his house would be plunged into darkness. But tonight was different. The voice was clear and desperate. "Please," the woman said, her voice echoing in the vast space of his living room. "Please don't look outside." The wind seemed to pick up, howling like a banshee outside his window. And then there was a flash of lightning. The lights flickered back on, and Thomas saw a girl standing at his window. She was beautiful, ethereal, almost otherworldly. Her long, flowing hair was the color of moonlight, and her skin glowed with an otherworldly light. She was soaked to the bone, her white dress clinging to her body, outlining her every move. But her face was what truly captivated Thomas. It was pale, almost translucent, with large, luminous eyes that seemed to pierce through him. Before he could react, she was gone. Then he heard a crash and a blood-curdling scream. Curiosity and fear warred within him. He wanted to investigate, but the voice had been so clear in her warning. Please don't look outside. What would he be looking at? Another flash of lightning illuminated the girl. She was kneeling on the ground, her back to him. Her head was bowed, her shoulders shaking as if in pain. Then she looked up. Their eyes met, and she screamed again, a terrible, soul-shaking sound that echoed the turmoil in his own heart. He wanted to call out to her, to ask if she was all right, but no sound came out of his throat. She was kneeling in the mud, her white dress now a canvas of brown, her ethereal beauty tarnished by the grime. Slowly she stood up. She was tall, taller than he was, and she was coming closer. With each step she took, the smile on her face grew wider, revealing teeth that were long and sharp, like the fangs of a snake. Panic surged through Thomas. He stumbled back, knocking over his chair. He tried to get up, but his legs wouldn't obey. They were rooted to the ground. He watched, horrified, as the girl approached, her eyes gleaming with a terrible light. Her hands were outstretched, her nails like talons. Closer and closer she came, her smile never fading. He wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't. He was frozen with fear. Then she was upon him, her face inches from his, and he saw the madness in her eyes, the hunger, the pure, unadulterated evil. And then she lunged. The radio crackled to life. Please, the woman's voice echoed, please don't look outside. Static. The last thing he heard before the darkness consumed him was the sound of his own scream. The next morning, the sun shone brightly, casting away the darkness of the night. Birds chirped merrily, their song echoing through the valley. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky that was clear and blue. Thomas's house was silent. The old radio sat on the table, its dial pointing to a station that was no longer broadcasting. There was a single footprint in the dust on the floor, a stark reminder of the horror that had unfolded the night before. The locals found Thomas that evening, his body lying on the floor, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. His house was empty, the windows smashed, the glass tinkling like shattered stars. There was no sign of a struggle. And outside, in the field, they found the girl. She was kneeling in the mud, her back to them, her shoulders shaking as if in pain. Her white dress was stained with blood, her ethereal beauty marred by the darkness that clung to her like a shroud. As the sun set, casting long, eerie shadows across the land, the girl rose. She turned, and for a moment, the villagers saw the madness in her eyes, the hunger, the pure, unadulterated evil. Then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness, leaving behind the echo of a scream and the promise of more to come. Once upon a time, in a bustling city, there was a notorious bus route. It was infamous for always being packed to the brim, filled with people from all walks of life. This route was like a melting pot of humanity. One particularly stormy evening, the heavens opened up and the rain poured down in torrents. People ran for cover, and that's when our story begins. A young man, let's call him Alex, desperately searched for shelter from the downpour. Spotting the brightly colored bus stop sign, he dashed over and waited for the bus. He watched as other commuters, drenched and shivering, made their way to the shelter of the bus stop. Some complained about the weather, others cursed the late-hour bus schedules, but most just stood silently, resigned to their fate of getting soaked. As the minutes ticked by, the group of strangers grew. When the bus finally arrived, its doors hissed open like a metal monster awakening. One by one, the drenched passengers filed onto the bus, each seeking warmth and comfort from the raging storm outside. Alex got on the bus and found a seat. But something was off. All around him, the passengers sat in a stony silence. Their eyes were fixed forward, their faces grim and unsmiling. It was as if they weren't just fellow passengers, but secret agents on a covert mission. They were all dressed in dark, nondescript clothing, their faces partially hidden under umbrellas or pulled tight against the wind. The bus rumbled to life and pulled away from the stop. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with an eerie quiet. Alex shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the low hum of the engine. He tried to strike up a conversation with a woman seated beside him, but she merely glanced at him, her face a mask of indifference before turning back to stare straight ahead. As the bus made its way through the rain-slicked streets, Alex couldn't shake off the feeling that something was amiss. The driver's face, weathered and grim, was etched with 1,000 untold stories. His eyes, sharp and intense, seemed to pierce through the gloom of the bus. At one point, the driver turned to the passengers, his voice a gravelly whisper that cut through the silence. "Next stop is your final destination," he said. A shiver ran down Alex's spine. His heart pounded in his chest. What had he gotten himself into? One by one, the passengers stirred. Their eyes, vacant and emotionless, turned towards the driver. For a moment, Alex saw not fellow passengers, but something else, something sinister lurking beneath their skin. When the bus finally screeched to a halt, the doors hissed open, and one by one, the passengers filed out. They walked without haste, their steps echoing in the deserted bus stop. As they disappeared into the shadows, Alex felt a growing sense of dread. He was the only one left on the bus. Then the driver turned to him, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "You shouldn't have gotten on," he said. Alex recoiled in surprise. The driver leaned closer, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "They are not human," he whispered, "but spirits bound to this bus, forever seeking new souls to join them." With that chilling revelation, the driver turned away, leaving Alex in the eerie silence of the bus. The rain had stopped, but the storm within Alex raged on. He stumbled out of the bus, his mind reeling. The driver's words echoed in his ears. As he looked back at the bus, he saw the door open slightly, as if inviting him back in, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he turned and ran. The image of the vacant, emotionless faces burned into his mind. From that day on, whenever he heard the rumble of a bus in the distance, he couldn't help but shudder. The memory of the empty bus and its ghostly passengers was a reminder of the unsettling secrets that sometimes lurk in the ordinary. The last thing anyone saw of Tommy and Billy Carter was them chasing a runaway kite during a summer storm. One minute they were there playing by the creek. The next, they were gone, vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their discarded kite, a half-eaten sandwich, and a pair of muddy shoes. It wasn't unusual for the Carter boys to disappear for a few hours at a time, usually turning up in the hayloft of Jebediah Pruitt's farm or hiding in the tower of the old grain silo, laughing at how scared their parents were when they thought they'd been kidnapped. But this time it was different. There was no sign of a struggle. Their disappearance was inexplicable, and most troubling of all, it had happened before. 7 years earlier, 2 other children had gone missing during a storm, Lily and Samuel Dixon. The sheriff's search came up empty-handed, and after a week of anxious searching, the distraught parents of Lily and Sammy had to face the grim reality that their kids were gone and most likely dead. The case went cold, and the town of Ashton moved on, or at least they tried to. But now, with 2 other children missing, the townspeople were beginning to get spooked. Whispers filled the streets. Had the Carter boys run away from home? Were they part of some nefarious cult that sacrificed children to the rain? Or was something more sinister at foot, something that walked in the rain, taking children with it? Old Man Withers, who lived on the outskirts of town, shook his head, muttering about how the younger folks never listened to the stories he told them. He remembered when the first rain collector came to town, a tall, gaunt man with hair like a hemp rope and eyes that glistened like polished stones. "I warned them then, just as I'm warning you now." Old Man Withers rasped, his voice like sandpaper on wood. "Stay inside when the rain comes, especially if there's thunder. That's when the rain collectors come for you." Withers said the townspeople didn't believe him, so he left them to their fate and moved to the safety of the hills. But the very next day, 2 children were found drowned in a gully. Withers was proven right, but still no one would listen. For the next few decades, a child would go missing every few years during a storm, taken by the rain collectors. And when the sheriff finally caught up to them, he found them living in a secluded cabin, chained to walls, their minds broken and vacant, their bodies withering away. The rain collectors were always careful to take children under the age of 10, just as the lawman had been. And they always made sure to only take 1 child from each family, just as the lawman had done. It took years for the townspeople to piece together what was happening, to realize there was only one way to stop the cycle of sorrow. Every full moon, a group of men would set out into the night to hunt down the rain collector, but they never came back. Some said the men had found the rain collector and killed him, but Old Man Withers knew better. He watched from afar as the men returned, dragging a young boy with them, his clothes torn and muddy, his eyes blank and soulless. They laid the boy on an altar in the center of town and cut his wrists and ankles, binding him with rough hempen ropes. Then they led him away from the town, deeper into the hills, to a cave hidden behind a waterfall. As the years passed, Withers saw many such rituals performed, many children sacrificed. Yet none of the townspeople learned their lesson. They continued to send their children out to play in the rain, and the rain collector continued to claim them. Then one day, Withers saw something that made his blood run cold. A little girl with hair the color of dandelion fluff skipped out of her house and ran into the rain. She laughed as the water soaked her clothes, and she danced and twirled until the wind snatched her hat and sent it tumbling down the street. She chased after it, oblivious to the danger. Withers wanted to scream, to warn her to go back, but his voice wouldn't cooperate. It was then that he realized the rain collector had claimed him long ago, taken his voice, and his ability to move, condemned him to watch as children disappeared, forever trapped in a purgatory of mud and stone. And as the rain fell that day, heavier and thicker than ever before, Old Man Withers wept. The girl was only 9 years old. The old clock tower had been silent for so long that no one in the city could remember it ever chiming. Its hands were frozen at 11:05, its bronze face obscured by creeping vines, and its wooden frame held together with more patches and prayers than was probably wise. But last night, a storm had rolled through town, a big one, with winds that rattled windows, and bent street lamps with rain that poured off roofs in thick brown rivers. And when the lightning struck, it struck the clock tower too. When the sun came up, the townspeople found that the clock was chiming. They stood below the tower, craning their necks to see the hands move. The chime was steady at first, each stroke of the bell clear and resonant. But then the bells began to echo, one after the other, the sound reverberating through the narrow streets. And that's when people started screaming. It wasn't a sound that everyone could hear. Only a few people stood beneath the clock tower, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror, as the echoes grew louder and the clock hands spun faster and faster. The old clock was counting down, but counting down to what? No one knew. Mayor Wilkins stood among them, his face drawn and haggard. He didn't need to hear the chime to know that something was wrong. The old clock hadn't just started working after all these years. It was making an announcement, one that chilled him to the bone despite the summer heat. "We should leave," he said, his voice hoarse. "Everyone should leave the city, now." Old Man Hemlock, who everyone said was a little touched in the head because he always wore a hat on his bald head, even in summer, took a step back from the tower. "Why? Why should we leave?" "Because the clock is counting down," someone said behind him. "It's counting down to midnight, and then the bells will toll again, and then the earth will crack and swallow us whole." Hemlock turned around to look at the speaker, a young woman with wild red hair and mud on her boots. "That's just a fairy tale. There's no such thing as the earth cracking open and swallowing people whole." She didn't answer him, but instead looked back at the clock tower, where the hands were now moving so quickly they were a blur. And sure enough, another chime sounded, this one lower and deeper than the others. Hemlock scoffed, though the sound didn't startle him half as much as it did the others. He'd heard that sound before, many years ago. He took a step closer to the tower, ignoring the shouts and screams behind him. He wasn't the only one who remembered. A group of children ran out of the schoolyard, their laughter echoing the chime. As they ran, they pointed at the sky, their faces upturned. "Do you hear that, Mama?" a little girl cried, clutching at her mother's skirt. "The sky is singing." Her mother, her face ashen, forced a smile. "Of course it is, sweetheart. It's just the wind." But the music swelled, becoming louder and clearer until it filled the entire city. And if you listened very carefully, you could make out the melody. It was a lullaby. Hemlock closed his eyes, the memory of the tune pulling at him like a wayward son returning to his father's home. He took another step closer to the tower, and the chimes, now deafening, resonated inside his bones. He wasn't afraid. In fact, he felt a sense of peace settle over him, a feeling that had eluded him for most of his life. He raised his head and laughed, a sound that cut through the din like a knife. The townspeople stared at him, their fear momentarily forgotten. "What are you doing?" the redhead cried. "Don't you understand? We have to get out of here." Hemlock opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't know why the clock had started chiming. He didn't know what would happen at midnight when the hands pointed to the hour. All he knew was that he didn't want to leave. Not again. The last chime faded into the rising wind. Rain began to fall, splattering on the cobblestones. The sky darkened, and the wind snatched at Hemlock's hat, threatening to knock it off his head. He dug his heels into the ground and held on tight, a wild grin splitting his face. Let the earth crack and swallow him whole. What had he to return to? The rain was pouring down in sheets, wind howling like a wounded animal, thunder rumbling ominously overhead. Inside, a woman was watching the storm unfold, mesmerized by its fury. She stood by the window, her silhouette framed against the lightning-filled sky. She was 32 years old and lived alone. Her husband was out of town on a business trip, which had become a regular occurrence over the past few months. She missed him terribly. Every night when she lay in bed, the silence was deafening. Every morning when she woke up, his side of the bed was cold. Their home, once filled with laughter and love, now echoed with emptiness. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight, as the storm raged outside, mimicking the turmoil in her heart, something strange happened. The phone rang. She turned from the window, startled. The old landline, the one that hadn't been used in months because their new house didn't have a connection, was ringing. She stared at it, confused. Who would be calling at this hour? And why the old number? They'd moved 5 years ago. The realtors were supposed to have disconnected it. Cautiously, she approached the phone and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" Her voice trembled, a mixture of fear and uncertainty in her tone. "Hello. Is my wife there?" a deep voice asked. She recognized that voice. It was her husband's voice. She gasped. He was supposed to be out of town. Was this a prank? Had someone found his phone and was trying to imitate him? "Who's this?" she asked, suspicion tinging her voice. "It's me," the voice said. "Don't you recognize your husband's voice?" The voice was amused, but her tone was sharp. "How can I be sure?" she asked cautiously. "I know you're alone tonight," the voice said, a hint of sadness in its tone. "And I know you're scared of thunderstorms." That was true. She had told him about her fear. How could this person know that? Unless it really was her husband. But how? Why wasn't his phone ringing then? "If you're playing some kind of a joke," she started. But the line went dead. She frowned, confusion and a touch of anger replacing her fear. Then the line went dead. She frowned. Confusion and a touch of anger replaced her fear. Then the phone started ringing again. She stared at it, unsure of what to do. Finally, she picked up the receiver. This time, the voice was urgent. "Please don't come outside," he said. "There's something you need to know." She felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't a joke anymore. "What do you want?" she whispered. "I'm sorry," the voice said. "I should have called sooner, but I didn't want you to worry. There's been an accident. I'm sorry." The voice broke. Before she could respond, the line went dead. Again, she could hear her husband's voice in her head, his words echoing in the silence of the room. There had been an accident. Was he hurt? She wanted to ask, but the line was dead. Then the phone rang again. She hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the receiver. When she heard the voice on the other end, she screamed. It was her husband's voice. "I love you," the voice said. "I love you so much. Please, forgive me." And then the line went dead. She dropped the receiver as if it had burned her. Tears streamed down her face. She didn't need the phone to tell her what had happened. Her husband's voice, the urgency in it, the sadness, the love. It had all been too real. She rushed to the window and looked out into the raging storm. In the distance, she saw the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. As the sirens grew louder, she knew her worst fears had been confirmed. The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if mirroring the turmoil in her heart. The wind screamed, the rain poured, and the thunder boomed. It was as if the heavens themselves were weeping. In the end, all she could do was watch the sky and cry, her husband's final words echoing in her ears. "I love you." In the heart of a city, there was a young boy named Ben, who was known for his infectious laughter and adventurous spirit. But one evening, a storm rolled in, shaking the very foundations of his home and rattling his sense of security. As the wind howled and the rain poured, Ben found himself alone in his room with his biggest fear, a monster under his bed. No amount of coaxing could convince him to go out into the raging storm, not when he was certain that the monster was using the heavy downpour as cover to sneak into his house. He had seen its massive shadow lurking outside his window just moments before it disappeared. Now, huddled under his blanket like a small turtle, he was too afraid to even look under the bed. But then, slowly, ever so slightly, he began to peek. He wanted to be brave, to conquer his fear, but the sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. There, in the dark space underneath, were two eyes that seemed to glow an eerie green. They blinked slowly, steadily, never once looking away from him. Ben couldn't help it. A scream caught in his throat, and he pulled back the blanket, shielding his face. But the scariest part was yet to come. The eyes under the bed began to glow brighter, and then a low growl rumbled from the darkness, sending shivers down Ben's spine. Unable to bear it any longer, he scrambled back, hitting his head hard on the bed frame. Tears welled up in his eyes, blurring the monster's image in his mind. But he knew if he closed his eyes, the monster would strike. So he kept them open, his gaze locked on the glowing eyes. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the growling stopped. The eyes under the bed dimmed and disappeared. Had he imagined the whole thing? He wondered, his heart still pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He wanted to believe it was all in his head, a figment of his storm-tossed imagination. But then he noticed something. Right in the middle of the floor where the bed had been, there was now a puddle of water, a single green leaf floating on its surface. And in that leaf, he saw the reflection of those glowing eyes, mocking him, taunting him. It was real. The monster was real. Panic surged through him. What was he gonna do? But amidst the chaos of his thoughts, something unexpected happened. A knock sounded on his door, followed by his mother's familiar voice. "Ben, honey, are you all right? I heard you yell." Relief washed over him like a tidal wave. Quickly, he scrambled out from under the bed, hiding the leaf behind a toy. As he called out, "I'm fine," he couldn't help but glance back at the spot where the monster had been lurking. Was it gone? Or was it waiting, planning its next move? His mother's footsteps approached, bringing with them the promise of safety. She entered the room, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. "You really scared me, Ben. What happened?" she asked, her gaze falling on the blanket that had fallen off his bed. He hesitated, torn between his fear of the monster and the love for his mother. Finally, he blurted out, I think there's a monster under my bed." His mother's face softened with understanding. She knew how vivid his imagination could be. She sat on the bed, pulling him into a tight hug. "Oh, Ben," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "There's no monster under your bed. It's just your imagination being a little too wild." She kissed his forehead. "Imagination can be a wonderful thing, Ben. It allows us to dream and explore new worlds. Sometimes it can get a little scary, but it's important to remember that you're safe, and I'm here with you. Always." Her words were like a soothing balm on his raw nerves. Slowly, he relaxed into her embrace, the tension leaving his shoulders. As the storm raged on outside, they stayed in that tight embrace, mother and son, united against the darkness and the fears that lingered in the shadows.